Joseph Joe Peterson had been emptying trash cans at Herbert Field Air Force Base for 5 years, and in all that time he'd perfected the art of being invisible. At 63, with silver hair and worn coveralls that had seen better days, he moved through the maintenance hangars like a ghost, quiet, efficient, and completely overlooked by the military personnel who ruled this world of cutting-edge aircraft and classified operations. Every morning at 4:30 a.m., Joe's battered Ford pickup would pull through the contractor's gate, his security badge barely glancing off the scanner. He'd nod to the guards who never really saw him, just another faceless civilian keeping the base clean while the real work happened around him. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 26 years in uniform, but now he was just the janitor. The AC-130 Spectre gunships dominated the flight line, their massive forms casting shadows across the tarmac. These weren't just aircraft, they were flying fortresses worth hundreds of millions, packed with electronic warfare systems, precision, sensors, and firepower that could level city blocks. Joe had watched countless maintenance crews swarm over them like ants, their conversations filled with technical jargon and the kind of confidence that came from extensive training and top-secret clearances. General Patricia Hammond ran Herbert Field, with the iron discipline of someone who'd clawed her way to the top in a man's world. She was respected, feared, and absolutely convinced that expertise came with rank and credentials. Her tours through the maintenance areas were legendary. She could spot a loose bolt from 50 feet and dress down a sergeant with surgical precision. But today, something was different. Joe noticed it first in the hushed conversations between the maintenance crews, then in the way Chief Master Sergeant Rebecca Torres kept glancing at the grounded AC-130 with barely concealed frustration. The massive gunship had been sitting motionless for 18 hours, its sophisticated systems offline, due to what the base's best technicians were calling the most complex electronic failure we've ever encountered. Joe continued his rounds, emptying wastebaskets filled with crumpled diagnostic printouts and energy drink cans, the debris of a frustrated maintenance crew. He'd learned to read the base's mood through its trash. Today, the garbage told a story of mounting pressure and failed solutions. "Sir, we've tried everything," Staff Sergeant Williams was explaining to Colonel Martinez as Joe worked nearby. "The electronic warfare systems are throwing conflicts we've never seen before. It's like the aircraft's brain is arguing with itself." Joe paused in his work, his trained ear catching the technical details they were discussing. The symptoms they described, random sensor malfunctions, communication blackouts, weapon system failures, painted a picture that was becoming clearer by the minute. But he said nothing. After all, who would listen to a janitor? The breakthrough moment came when General Hammond herself arrived at the maintenance hangar, her presence causing the already tense atmosphere to ratchet up another notch. Joe watched from the shadows as she surveyed the scene. Her prize aircraft grounded, her best people stumped, and a critical deployment schedule hanging in the balance.
"Ma'am, we're at a loss," Chief Torres admitted, her voice tight with professional frustration. "We've run every diagnostic, checked every system, followed every protocol. The aircraft's electronic systems are completely incompatible with each other."
"But we can't figure out why." That's when Colonel Martinez, perhaps driven by desperation or a half-remembered conversation, made the suggestion that would change everything. "What about asking Joe to take a look? I heard he used to work on these things." The silence that followed was deafening. General Hammond's laugh cut through the air like a blade, sharp with disbelief and condescension. "Sure, why not? At this point, we might as well let the cleaning crew fix what our certified technicians can't figure out." Joe felt the familiar sting of dismissal, the same feeling he'd carried for 5 years as people looked through him rather than at him. But beneath that familiar hurt, something else stirred. A quiet confidence born from a knowledge that ran deeper than any technical manual. He set down his mop bucket and walked toward the aircraft, his movements suddenly less shuffling, more purposeful. The maintenance crew watched with a mixture of curiosity and barely contained amusement as the old janitor approached their million-dollar problem. "Mom," Joe said quietly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who'd learned to speak carefully, "if you don't mind, I'd like to take a look." General Hammond's eyebrows rose in surprise. It was the first time she'd heard the janitor speak more than a few words, and something in his tone made her pause. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the way he moved toward the aircraft with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "By all means," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Show us what we're missing." Joe nodded once and walked toward the AC-130, his hand reaching for access panels, with the kind of muscle memory that came from decades of practice. As he worked, the crowd of observers grew larger, drawn by the spectacle of a custodian attempting to solve a problem that had defeated the base's best minds. What none of them knew, what Joe had carried silently for 5 years, was that the man in the worn coveralls had helped design the very systems that were now failing. He'd been there when the first electronic warfare packages were installed, had worked through the integration challenges that were now causing problems decades later, and had maintained operational security about his past, even as he emptied their trash cans. The next 30 minutes would either confirm their assumptions about his limitations or shatter everything they thought they knew about expertise, credentials, and the true value of experience. The impossible problem, the AC-130 Spectre, loomed. Before Joe like a sleeping giant, its darkened cockpit windows reflecting the fluorescent hangar lights. For 18 hours, it had resisted every attempt at revival, its electronic systems locked in a conflict that had stumped Herbert Field's most experienced maintenance crews. The aircraft represented not just millions in taxpayer dollars, but the hopes of ground forces who might depend on its precision firepower in some distant theater of operations. Chief Master Sergeant Rebecca Torres stood with her arms crossed, watching Joe approach the aircraft with barely concealed skepticism. She'd spent 15 years climbing the ranks in aircraft maintenance, earning her position through grueling technical training and countless hours troubleshooting the most complex military systems ever built. The idea that a janitor could solve what her certified technicians couldn't bordered on insulting. "The primary issue is in the electronic warfare suite," she explained, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone addressing a child. "The systems are generating conflicts that shouldn't be possible according to the technical specifications. We've replaced components, reset software, even brought in specialists from the manufacturer. Nothing works." Joe nodded, his weathered hands already moving toward the aircraft's access panels with surprising familiarity. The crowd of observers had grown to include nearly a dozen maintenance personnel, each one eager to witness what they assumed would be a quick confirmation of their own expertise and the janitor's limitations. Staff Sergeant Williams pulled out his phone, discreetly filming what he expected to be an entertaining failure. "This should be good," he whispered to his colleague. "Old guy probably thinks he can fix it with WD-40 and duct tape." But as Joe began his examination, something unexpected happened. His movements weren't those of an amateur fumbling through unfamiliar systems. Instead, he navigated the aircraft's complex interior with the fluid confidence of someone who'd spent decades in these cramped spaces. His hands found access panels, diagnostic ports, and component housings without hesitation, as if he were following a map burned into his memory. General Hammond watched from a distance, her initial amusement giving way to curiosity as Joe's examination revealed knowledge that seemed impossibly detailed for a custodian. He wasn't just looking at the systems, he was reading them, interpreting. the relationships between components in ways that suggested deep understanding of their design and function.
"Ma'am," Colonel Martinez said quietly, moving closer to the general, "I think there might be more to Joe than we realized. I've heard fragments of conversations over the years, mentions of his background that didn't quite add up to just custodial
work." The breakthrough came when Joe opened a panel that housed the aircraft's integrated electronic warfare system, a maze of processors, sensors, and communication devices that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The maintenance crews had focused their attention on individual components, testing each system in isolation according to established protocols. But Joe approached the problem differently. "The issue isn't with any single system," he said, his
voice carrying across the hangar with unexpected authority. "It's with how they're integrated."
The electronic warfare package is trying to communicate with the communications suite using protocols that were updated in the newer hardware but not in the legacy systems. Chief Torres stepped closer, her skepticism wavering as Joe's explanation revealed understanding that went far beyond basic technical knowledge. "How could you possibly know that? We've been working with these systems for years, and none of our diagnostics showed integration conflicts." Joe's response was to pull out a small notebook, the kind that maintenance personnel carried to record important information, but instead of hastily scrawled notes, his pages contained detailed diagrams and technical specifications that looked like they'd been drawn by an engineer, because I helped design the integration protocols when they were first installed. The original systems were configured to handle specific communication timing, but the newer upgrades changed those parameters. The silence that followed was profound. Williams stopped filming, his phone forgotten in his hand, as the implications of Joe's words sank in. Chief Torres stared at the notebook pages, recognizing technical details that weren't included in any current maintenance manual. General Hammond moved closer, her expression shifting from skepticism to intense interest. "Who are you?" she asked, quietly. Joe looked up from the aircraft systems, his eyes holding decades of accumulated knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. Senior Master Sergeant Joseph Peterson, retired. 26 years active duty, specialized in electronic warfare systems and AC-130 maintenance. I was part of the original development team for the integration protocols that are causing your current problems. The revelation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. The janitor they'd dismissed, the invisible man who'd emptied their trash for 5 years, was one of the original architects of the very systems they'd been struggling to understand. His custodial position hadn't been a reflection of his capabilities. It had been a cover for knowledge so specialized and sensitive that it couldn't be officially acknowledged. "The diagnostic procedures you've been using are based on current technical manuals," Joe continued, his hands working with practiced efficiency as he began making adjustments to the aircraft systems. "But they don't account for the integration challenges that were resolved during the original installation. The systems aren't malfunctioning, they're reverting to their original configuration parameters." Chief Torres watched in fascination as Joe's modifications began to resolve conflicts that had seemed impossible to diagnose. His understanding of the systems extended beyond technical knowledge to include the institutional memory of how and why design decisions had been made decades earlier. "How long have you been carrying this knowledge?" "Since 1983, Joe replied, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in operational silence. "I've been watching your maintenance crews struggle with problems that I helped solve 30 years ago, but my security clearance and current position made it impossible to offer assistance." The AC-130 systems began responding to Joe's adjustments, status lights shifting from red to amber to green as integration conflicts resolved themselves. The aircraft was coming back to life under the hands of a man who'd been dismissed as irrelevant proving that expertise often existed in the most unexpected places. General Hammond watched the resurrection of her aircraft with growing amazement and a dawning recognition of how badly she'd misjudged the situation. The next few minutes would determine not just whether the AC-130 would fly again, but whether her understanding of military expertise would survive the revelation intact. As the AC-130 systems continued their revival under Joe's expert touch, the maintenance hangar buzzed with uncomfortable energy. General Hammond stood transfixed, watching her impossible problem dissolve under the hands of someone she'd dismissed as worthless just minutes earlier. The weight of her misjudgment pressed down on her like a physical force, each successful diagnostic light a reminder of how thoroughly she'd been wrong. "Ma'am," Chief Torres said quietly, moving closer to the general, "I think we need to talk about what this means for our maintenance protocols. If Joe has been sitting on this knowledge for 5 years..." He's been sitting on it because we never..."
asked Colonel Martinez, interrupted, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and frustration.
"We've been so focused on credentials and official qualifications that we completely overlooked actual expertise. The crowd of maintenance personnel had grown silent, their initial amusement replaced by professional embarrassment. Staff Sergeant Williams pocketed his phone, realizing that his intended comedy video had become documentation of their collective failure to recognize competence. The young technicians who'd been struggling with the aircraft's problems watched Joe work with expressions of fascination and dawning respect. Joe continued his methodical approach to the aircraft systems, his movements economical and precise. Each adjustment was made with the confidence of someone who understood not just what to do, but why it needed to be done. His notebook remained open beside him, its pages filled with technical diagrams that represented decades of accumulated knowledge. The original integration was designed to handle specific electromagnetic interference patterns, Joe explained as he worked, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd taught these procedures to countless technicians over the years. But the newer communication systems generate different interference signatures. The electronic warfare package is trying to compensate for patterns that no longer exist. General Hammond found herself drawn closer to the aircraft, fascinated despite her professional discomfort. How is it possible that our current maintenance personnel don't know this? We have the most advanced training programs in the world. Because the knowledge was classified, Joe replied without looking up from his work. The original integration procedures were part of a classified program that was compartmentalized. When the program ended, the institutional knowledge was supposed to be preserved in technical documentation, but the classification levels made it impossible to include certain details. The implications of Joe's words rippled through the assembled crowd. They were dealing with a problem that had been created by the intersection of advancing technology and bureaucratic security requirements. The very systems designed to protect sensitive information had prevented the preservation of knowledge needed to maintain the equipment. Chief Torres pulled out her own notebook, frantically scribbling notes as Joe worked. "We need to document everything you're doing. This knowledge can't be lost again." "It won't be," Joe assured her, making final adjustments to a series of integrated circuits, but the documentation will need to be handled carefully. Some of these procedures are still classified, even 30 years later. The AC-130's master systems panel suddenly illuminated with a steady pattern of green lights, indicating that all primary systems were operational. The massive aircraft was ready to fly again, its electronic conflicts resolved through the application of knowledge that had been hidden in plain sight for 5 years. General Hammond stared at the aircraft's status display, her expression mixing relief with profound professional introspection. The grounded gunship represented not just a maintenance victory, but a fundamental challenge to her assumptions about military expertise and the relationship between official position and actual capability. "Sergeant Peterson," she said, using his retired rank for the first time. "I owe you an apology. We all do." Joe closed his notebook and stepped back from the aircraft, his expression reflecting neither triumph nor resentment. "No apology needed, ma'am. I understood the situation when I took this position. Sometimes the most valuable service happens in the background." The maintenance crews began their final checks, preparing the AC-130 for its delayed deployment. But the real work was just beginning. The work of understanding how institutional knowledge could be preserved and utilized while respecting the security requirements that governed military operations. Colonel Martinez approached Joe with genuine
curiosity. "Why didn't you ever say anything? 5 years of watching us struggle with problems you could solve."
"Because I learned a long time ago that respect is earned through demonstrated competence, not claimed through past achievements," Joe replied. "Today was the first time anyone asked for my help with something I actually knew how to do." The words hit the assembled officers like a challenge, forcing them to confront the possibility that their organization might be wasting valuable expertise through assumptions and bureaucratic inertia. The quiet custodian who'd been invisible for 5 years had just demonstrated that true capability often existed in the most unexpected places. As the AC-130 prepared for its return to operational status, the real questions were just beginning. How many other veterans were carrying similar knowledge in civilian positions? How much institutional wisdom was being lost because of assumptions about job titles and official qualifications? And most importantly, how could the military better identify and utilize the expertise that existed within its extended community? The aircraft was ready to fly, but the larger mission of understanding and preserving institutional knowledge had only just begun. The successful revival of the AC-130 sent shockwaves through Herbert Field's command structure that extended far beyond the maintenance hangar. Within hours of the aircraft's return to operational status, General Hammond found herself fielding calls from Pentagon officials who wanted to understand how a custodial contractor had solved a problem that had stumped the Air Force's most advanced maintenance specialists. Colonel Martinez had spent the afternoon conducting a thorough review of Joe's background, uncovering a service record that read like a catalogue of the military's most sensitive aircraft programs. The documentation revealed assignments to classified projects, specialized training in electronic warfare systems, and commendations for technical innovations that had never been publicly acknowledged. "Patricia, we need to talk," Martinez said, entering the general's office with a folder thick with documents. "Joe Peterson isn't just a retired maintenance sergeant. He's one of the original developers of the AC-130 electronic warfare integration protocols. His fingerprints are on systems that are still classified." General Hammond looked up from her own stack of reports, her expression reflecting the professional turmoil that had consumed her day. "I've been getting calls from Washington asking how we discovered this knowledge. The program office wants to know if we've had unauthorized access to classified development information." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Joe's legitimate knowledge was being questioned because it seemed impossible that such expertise could exist in someone with his current position. The bureaucratic systems designed to protect sensitive information were now creating suspicion about the very person who'd originally helped develop it. "We need to have a formal conversation with him," Hammond decided. "Not just about the aircraft repair, but about what other knowledge might be walking around this base in Janitor's coveralls." The meeting was arranged for the following morning in a secure conference room normally reserved for classified briefings. Joe arrived in his usual coveralls, but his demeanor had subtly shifted. The invisible custodian had been replaced by someone whose posture and bearing suggested decades of military service and technical expertise. "Sergeant Peterson," General Hammond began, using his retired rank deliberately, "we need to understand the full scope of your background and knowledge. The Pentagon is asking questions about how you acquired the information you used to repair the AC-130. Joe opened his worn notebook and placed it on the conference table. Everything I did yesterday was based on knowledge I acquired during my active duty service. I was part of the original AC-130 electronic warfare integration program from 1983 to 1997. My security clearance was never revoked. It was simply allowed to lapse when I retired. Colonel Martinez leaned forward. Why didn't you mention this? Background when you applied for the custodial position. Because I didn't apply for it, Joe replied calmly. I was recruited for it. The position was offered to me by a contractor who understood that having someone with my background on the base might be valuable, even in an unofficial capacity. The revelation that Joe's custodial position was itself a form of unofficial consultation arrangement added another layer of complexity to the situation. His presence at Herbert Field hadn't been coincidental. It had been a deliberate placement designed to maintain access to institutional knowledge while respecting the security restrictions that prevented official acknowledgement of his expertise. Who recruited you? General Hammond asked, already suspecting the answer would lead to another rabbit hole of classified arrangements and unofficial knowledge preservation networks. Colonel James Harrison retired, Joe said. He was my commanding officer during the original AC-130 program. He understood that the institutional knowledge was being lost as personnel retired, and he wanted to ensure that someone with the background would be available if needed. Harrison's name was familiar to both officers. He'd been a legendary figure in special operations aircraft development before his retirement. His unofficial mentorship networks were known throughout the Air Force, though their full extent had never been formally documented. Chief Torres, who'd been invited to the meeting due to her direct involvement in the maintenance crisis, spoke up. How many other situations like this exist? How many other people with specialized knowledge are working in positions where their expertise isn't recognized? Joe's answer was sobering, more than you might expect. The combination of security restrictions, bureaucratic inertia, and assumptions about job titles has created a situation where valuable knowledge exists but can't be officially utilized. I know at least a dozen retired personnel in similar situations. The implications extended far beyond Herbert Field. The military's approach to knowledge preservation and utilization was creating gaps that were being filled by informal networks of retired personnel who maintained their expertise while working in civilian positions. The system was simultaneously protecting sensitive information and preventing its effective use. What do you recommend? General Hammond asked, recognizing that she was dealing with systemic issues rather than isolated incidents. Create formal mechanisms for identifying and utilizing veteran expertise while respecting security requirements, Joe suggested. Establish programs that allow cleared personnel to maintain their knowledge contributions without requiring them to remain on active duty. And most importantly, train current personnel to recognize that expertise often exists in unexpected places. The meeting concluded with a recognition that Joe's repair of the AC-130 was symptom of larger challenges facing the military's approach to knowledge management and personnel utilization. The immediate crisis had been resolved, but the underlying issues required systemic changes that would take years to implement. As Joe returned to his custodial duties, the officers remained in the conference room to discuss how to address the broader implications of what they'd discovered. The invisible man had become visible, but the questions he'd raised would require answers that challenged fundamental assumptions about military expertise and institutional knowledge. The AC-130 was flying again, but the real work of understanding and preserving military knowledge had only just begun. The weeks following Joe's dramatic repair of the AC-130 brought unexpected changes to Herbert Field that rippled through the base's entire operational structure. General Hammond had initiated a comprehensive review of contractor personnel, specifically looking for other veterans whose backgrounds might be hiding valuable expertise. The results were both revealing and disturbing. The review uncovered a landscaping crew supervisor who'd been a former explosives ordnance specialist a cafeteria manager who'd previously worked in military logistics, and a security guard who'd spent 15 years in military intelligence. Each of them possessed specialized knowledge that could contribute to current operations, but their expertise was being wasted due to assumptions about their current roles. "We've been sitting on a goldmine of institutional knowledge," Colonel Martinez reported during a staff meeting. "But our personnel systems are so focused on official credentials that we're completely missing the human resources right under our noses." The Pentagon's response to Herbert Field's discoveries was swift and comprehensive. Within a month, a formal program was established to identify and utilize veteran expertise across military installations. The program, officially designated as the Institutional Knowledge Preservation Initiative, was designed to bridge the gap between retired expertise and current operational needs. Joe found himself at the center of these changes, his role evolving from invisible custodian to acknowledged technical consultant. His security clearance was reactivated, and he was officially designated as a contractor specialist in AC-130 electronic warfare systems. The promotion came with a substantial increase in pay and formal recognition of his contributions to military aviation. But the changes weren't universally welcomed. Some of the younger maintenance personnel resented the implication that their training and certifications were somehow inadequate. Staff Sergeant Williams, in particular, struggled with the recognition that a man he'd dismissed as just a janitor possessed knowledge that exceeded his own technical expertise. "I spent 4 years in technical training," Williams complained to Chief Torres during a private conversation. "I have certifications from the manufacturer, advanced degrees in electronic systems, and 5 years of hands-on experience. How is it fair that someone with an old security clearance suddenly becomes the expert?" Torres's response was measured but firm. Because experience and institutional knowledge aren't the same as technical training. Joe didn't just learn how to maintain these systems, he helped design them. His knowledge includes understanding of why design decisions were made, how systems were intended to function, and how to solve problems that weren't anticipated during the original development. The conversation highlighted the broader cultural challenges facing the military's efforts to preserve and utilize institutional knowledge. Recognizing veteran expertise required current personnel to acknowledge that their formal training might be incomplete and that valuable knowledge existed outside the traditional channels of military education and certification. Joe approached these challenges with characteristic patience and humility. Rather than asserting his authority as an expert, he focused on mentoring younger technicians and sharing knowledge in ways that enhanced their capabilities rather than threatening their positions. His teaching methods were informal but effective, emphasizing practical understanding over theoretical knowledge. "The technical manuals will tell you what to do," Joe explained during an impromptu training session, "but understanding why you're doing it requires knowledge of how the systems were designed to function together." That's where experience becomes valuable, not as a replacement for technical training, but as a complement to it. The integration of veteran expertise into current operations required careful navigation of security requirements, bureaucratic procedures, and interpersonal dynamics. But the results were undeniable. Maintenance efficiency improved, problem-solving capabilities increased, and the base's overall operational readiness reached levels that hadn't been seen in years. General Hammond's reputation within the Air Force was enhanced by her leadership in recognizing and addressing the institutional knowledge gap. Her willingness to admit her initial misjudgment and implement systemic changes was seen as a model for other commanders facing similar challenges. Patricia has shown that real leadership involves recognizing when you're wrong and taking action to fix it, commented General Robert Casey during a Pentagon briefing. The Herbert Field model is being implemented across the Air Force because it demonstrates how to effectively utilize our most valuable resource, the knowledge and experience of our veterans. The AC-130 Program Office formally recognized Joe's contributions to aircraft development and maintenance, creating official documentation that preserved his knowledge for future generations of technicians. His diagnostic procedures were incorporated into training programs, and his insights into system integration were included in updated technical manuals. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Herbert Field had become a place where expertise was recognized regardless of its source, where veterans were valued for their knowledge as well as their service, and where the artificial barriers between official positions and actual capabilities had been significantly reduced. Joe continued his work with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd found his proper place in the world. The invisible man had become visible, but more importantly, the knowledge he'd carried in silence for decades was now being shared, preserved, and utilized for the benefit of current and future military operations. The transformation was complete, not just of Joe's status, but of the entire base's approach to recognizing and utilizing the expertise that existed within its extended community. The lesson learned was simple but profound. Valuable knowledge often exists in unexpected places, and organizations that fail to recognize and utilize that knowledge do so at their own peril. 6 months after the AC-130 incident, Herbert Field had become a model for military installations across the country, but the transformation hadn't been without its challenges. The Institutional Knowledge Preservation Initiative had identified over 200 veterans in contractor positions whose expertise could contribute to current operations. But implementing these discoveries required navigating complex bureaucratic and security procedures. General Hammond found herself testifying before Congress about the program's success, her presentation highlighting both the achievements and the systemic issues that had allowed valuable knowledge to remain hidden for years. The hearing room was packed with military officials, veteran advocates, and media representatives eager to understand how the janitor who fixed the unfixable had exposed fundamental flaws in military knowledge management. The problem wasn't that we lacked expertise, Hammond explained to the assembled congressmen. The problem was that we'd created systems that prevented us from recognizing and utilizing the expertise that already existed within our communities. We were so focused on official credentials that we completely overlooked actual capabilities. Joe sat in the gallery, watching the proceedings with the same quiet attention he'd brought to his custodial duties. His transformation from invisible contractor to recognized expert had been complete, but he remained uncomfortable with the public attention that came with his new status. The real satisfaction came from knowing that his knowledge was being preserved and transmitted to future generations of military technicians. The Pentagon's formal adoption of the Herbert Field model represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached veteran expertise and institutional knowledge preservation. New programs were established to identify and utilize veteran capabilities. Security procedures were streamlined to allow for appropriate knowledge sharing, and personnel policies were modified to recognize expertise regardless of its source. But the most significant change was in the military's approach to contractor personnel. No longer were civilian positions viewed as separate from military operations. They were recognized as integral parts of the defense community that might contain valuable expertise and institutional knowledge. Chief Torres had been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and was now leading the Air Force's efforts to implement the knowledge preservation program across special operations units. Her experience at Herbert Field had taught her that expertise often existed in unexpected places, and her new role involved training other commanders to recognize and utilize veteran capabilities. The biggest challenge isn't identifying the expertise, she explained, during a training session for base commanders. It's overcoming the cultural barriers that prevent us from recognizing knowledge that doesn't come with official credentials. We've been trained to respect rank and position, but sometimes the most valuable insights come from people whose current roles don't reflect their full capabilities. Staff Sergeant Williams had initially struggled with the changes, but eventually became one of Joe's most dedicated students. His technical training was enhanced by Joe's institutional knowledge, creating a combination of current procedures and historical understanding that made him one of the most effective AC-130 maintenance specialists in the Air Force. "I had to get past my ego," Williams admitted during an interview for Air Force magazine. "I thought my formal education and certifications made me the expert, but I learned that knowledge comes in many forms. Joe didn't replace my training. He enhanced it with understanding that couldn't be found in any textbook." The AC-130 program office established a formal advisory board that included retired personnel who'd contributed to aircraft development over the decades. The board served as a bridge between institutional knowledge and current operations, ensuring that design decisions and maintenance procedures were informed by historical understanding as well as current requirements. Joe's notebook, the worn collection of diagrams and procedures that had seemed insignificant to observers, was digitized and incorporated into the official AC-130 technical library. His hand-drawn schematics and handwritten notes became part of the permanent record, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost with his retirement. The program's success extended beyond Herbert Field to installations across the country. Similar discoveries were made at other bases, revealing a network of veteran expertise that had been hidden in plain sight for years. Security guards with intelligence backgrounds, maintenance workers with specialized technical knowledge, and administrative personnel with operational experience were identified and integrated into appropriate roles. The cultural transformation was perhaps the most important achievement. Military installations began to view their contractor personnel as valuable resources rather than simply service providers. Regular forums were established to allow veterans to share their knowledge and experience, creating formal mechanisms for the kind of informal mentorship that had always existed but was rarely acknowledged or utilized. Joe's story became a case study in military leadership schools, illustrating the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source, and the dangers of making assumptions based on current positions or official credentials. His quiet competence and patient approach to sharing knowledge became a model for other veterans seeking to contribute their expertise to current operations. The final vindication came when the AC-130 that Joe had repaired achieved perfect operational status during a deployment to Afghanistan, its electronic warfare systems functioning flawlessly in combat conditions. The mission's success was attributed in part to maintenance procedures that had been developed based on Joe's institutional knowledge and historical understanding of system integration. General Hammond's final report on the institutional knowledge preservation initiative concluded with a simple but profound observation. The most valuable military asset isn't our equipment or our technology, it's our people and their accumulated knowledge and experience. Our responsibility as leaders is to ensure that this knowledge is recognized, preserved, and utilized for the benefit of current and future operations. Joe returned to his work at Herbert Field, but his role had evolved far beyond maintenance and consultation. He had become a bridge between past and present, ensuring that the institutional knowledge gained through decades of military service would continue to benefit the next generation of airmen and the missions they would undertake. 1 year after the AC-130 incident that changed everything, Herbert Field hosted a ceremony that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The base was celebrating the graduation of the first class of the Institutional Knowledge Preservation Program, a formal initiative that had grown from Joe's quiet repair work into a comprehensive system for identifying and utilizing veteran expertise across the military. The ceremony was attended by senior officials from across the Department of Defense, veteran advocacy groups, and media representatives who had followed the story from its humble beginnings to its current status as a model for military knowledge management. But for Joe, the most meaningful attendees were the young technicians who had learned from his mentorship and were now prepared to carry forward both technical expertise and institutional wisdom. General Hammond, now promoted to Lieutenant General and serving as the program's executive director, delivered the keynote address to an audience that included hundreds of veterans who had been identified and integrated into appropriate roles across military installations. Her words reflected the personal and professional transformation that had resulted from recognizing her own misjudgment and taking action to address systemic issues. 1 year ago, I made a mistake that could have cost lives and missions, she began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. I dismissed expertise because it didn't come with the credentials I expected. I assumed that knowledge could be measured by position and rank rather than by experience and capability. Today, we're celebrating not just the correction of that mistake, but the transformation of how our military recognizes and utilizes the knowledge of our veterans. The program's success metrics were impressive. Over 3,000 veterans had been identified and integrated into roles that utilize their specialized knowledge. Maintenance efficiency had improved by 30% across participating installations. Training programs had been enhanced with institutional knowledge that had previously been lost when personnel retired. Most importantly, the military had created sustainable systems for preserving and transmitting expertise across generations of service members. Joe received the Defense Department's Exceptional Civilian Service Award, the highest recognition that could be given to a contractor. But he was more proud of the program's impact on other veterans who had found their expertise recognized and valued after years of being overlooked. His story had become a catalyst for broader recognition of veteran capabilities and contributions to national defense. The ceremony included testimonials from veterans whose lives had been changed by the program. A former Army helicopter pilot who had been working as a mechanic was now training current aviators in aircraft systems. A retired Navy electronics specialist who had been doing security work was now consulting on communications equipment. A former marine logistics expert who had been driving a delivery truck was now improving supply chain operations at his local installation. The program didn't just change my career, explained Maria Rodriguez, a former Air Force intelligence analyst who had been working in food service. It changed my sense of purpose. I had skills and knowledge that I thought were no longer relevant, but now I'm using them to train the next generation of intelligence professionals. The most significant validation came from operational commanders who reported improved mission readiness and capability as a result of integrating veteran expertise into their operations. Combat units were better prepared, equipment failures were resolved more quickly, and institutional knowledge that had taken decades to develop was being preserved and transmitted to new personnel. Colonel Martinez, now promoted to Brigadier General and serving as the program's military director, shared statistics that demonstrated the initiative's impact on national defense capabilities. We've not only improved our current readiness, he explained, but we've created systems that ensure critical knowledge won't be lost when experienced personnel retire. We're building institutional resilience that will benefit the military for generations. The ceremony concluded with Joe addressing the audience, his first public speech since the AC-130 incident. Standing at the podium in his dress uniform, which he'd worn for the first time in over a decade, he embodied the transformation that was possible when organizations recognized and valued all forms of expertise. For 5 years, I emptied trash cans and mopped floors while watching brilliant young technicians struggle with problems I could have helped solve, Joe said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent audience. Not because anyone was trying to waste my knowledge, but because our systems weren't designed to recognize expertise that didn't come with official credentials. He paused, looking out at the faces of veterans, active duty personnel, and civilian leaders who had gathered to celebrate the program's success. The real lesson isn't about me or the AC-130. It's about understanding that knowledge and experience exist throughout our communities, often in the most unexpected places. Our responsibility is to create systems that recognize and utilize that knowledge for the benefit of everyone. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, but Joe was already thinking about the work that remained to be done. The STAY program had achieved remarkable success, but he knew that changing institutional culture was an ongoing process that would require constant attention and commitment. After the ceremony, Joe returned to Herbert Field, where his role had evolved into Senior Technical Advisor for AC-130 operations. His office was located in the same maintenance hangar where he'd once emptied trash cans, but now it served as a center for knowledge preservation and transmission. The walls were covered with technical diagrams, historical photographs, and testimonials from technicians who had benefited from his mentorship. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued. Joe spent his days working with young technicians, sharing not just technical procedures, but the institutional wisdom that came from decades of experience with complex military systems. His approach remained the same, patient, methodical, and focused on understanding rather than just following procedures. "The aircraft will tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen," he would tell his students, echoing lessons he'd learned decades earlier. But listening requires understanding not just what the systems are supposed to do, but why they were designed to do it that way. Staff Sergeant Williams, now a technical sergeant, and one of the Air Force's most capable AC-130 maintenance specialists, often served as Joe's teaching assistant. Their relationship had evolved from skepticism to mutual respect, demonstrating how mentorship could bridge generational and cultural gaps in military organizations. "Joe taught me that being an expert isn't about having all the answers," Williams explained to new technicians. "It's about knowing how to find the answers and understanding why they work. That's the difference between following procedures and really understanding the systems you're working on." The program's influence extended beyond military installations to defense contractors, aerospace companies, and educational institutions that recognize the value of integrating veteran expertise into their operations. Joe found himself consulting with organizations across the defense industry, helping them develop programs to identify and utilize the knowledge of their veteran employees. The AC-130 that Joe had repaired continued to serve with distinction, its electronic warfare systems performing flawlessly in operations around the world. But more importantly, the maintenance procedures he had developed were now being used by technicians who understood not just what to do, but why they were doing it and how their work connected to the broader mission of supporting combat operations. As Joe looked back on the transformation that had resulted from 30 minutes of diagnostic work, he was struck by how small actions could have far-reaching consequences when they addressed fundamental issues. His repair of a single aircraft had exposed systemic problems that affected the entire military, leading to changes that would benefit veterans and active duty personnel for decades to come. The invisible man had become visible, but more importantly, he had helped create systems that would ensure other invisible experts would be recognized and valued for their contributions to national defense. The lesson was simple but profound. In organizations as complex as the modern military, expertise existed everywhere. The challenge was creating cultures and systems that could recognize and utilize that expertise effectively. 5 years after the AC-130 incident that changed everything, Joe Peterson stood in the same Herbert Field maintenance hangar where his journey from invisible custodian to recognized expert had begun. But now the space looked dramatically different, transformed into a state-of-the-art training facility that served as the headquarters for the Institutional Knowledge Preservation Program, now operational at military installations worldwide. The hangar buzzed with activity as teams of veterans and active duty personnel collaborated on complex technical challenges, their combined expertise creating solutions that neither group could have achieved alone. The cultural transformation that had begun with Joe's quiet competence had evolved into a fundamental shift in how the military approached knowledge management and veteran utilization. At 68, Joe had officially retired from his advisory position, but his influence continued to shape the program's development and implementation. The training protocols he had developed were being used at installations across 6 continents, and his approach to mentorship had become the standard for integrating veteran expertise into current operations. The numbers told an impressive story of transformation. The program had identified and integrated over 15,000 veterans into roles that utilized their specialized knowledge. Equipment readiness rates had improved by an average of 40% at participating installations. Training programs enhanced with institutional knowledge were producing technicians who understood not just procedures, but the underlying principles that made those procedures effective. But for Joe, the most meaningful measure of success was personal. The letters from veterans who had found their expertise recognized and valued, the reports from young technicians who had benefited from mentorship programs, and the knowledge that institutional wisdom was being preserved for future generations. General Hammond, now serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, had made the preservation and utilization of veteran expertise a cornerstone of military human resources policy. Her transformation from skeptical commander to program champion had become a case study in adaptive leadership and the importance of recognizing when fundamental assumptions needed to be questioned. Joe didn't just fix an aircraft, she reflected during a recent interview. He fixed our understanding of how expertise develops and where it can be found. The program's success isn't measured just in improved readiness, it's measured in changed minds and transformed cultures. The ripple effects of Joe's story extended far beyond military installations. Corporate America had embraced similar programs to identify and utilize veteran expertise within their workforces. Educational institutions had developed curricula that combined formal training with experiential knowledge. Government agencies had implemented systems to preserve institutional wisdom that might otherwise be lost when experienced personnel retired. The AC-130 Program Office had established the Peterson Technical Excellence Award, given annually to individuals who demonstrated exceptional problem-solving capabilities through the application of institutional knowledge. The award honored not just technical competence, but the patient mentorship and knowledge sharing that Joe had exemplified throughout his career. Williams, now a Master Sergeant and the Air Force's youngest AC-130 training supervisor, often told Joe's story to new technicians, emphasizing the importance of recognizing expertise regardless of its source. His own career had been transformed by learning to value experience alongside formal education, and he had become one of the program's most effective advocates. Senior Master Sergeant Peterson taught me that being a technician isn't just about fixing things, Williams would tell his students. It's about understanding why things break and how to prevent problems before they occur. That kind of understanding comes from experience, and experience exists throughout our community. We just have to be smart enough to recognize and learn from it. The maintenance hangar now featured a permanent display honoring the veterans whose knowledge had contributed to the program's success. Joe's photograph was prominently featured, along with his worn notebook and the technical diagrams that had once been dismissed as the scribbles of a janitor. But he was just one of hundreds of veterans whose stories demonstrated the value of recognizing expertise in unexpected places. The program had also addressed the security challenges that had initially prevented the recognition and utilization of veteran expertise. New classification guidelines allowed for appropriate knowledge sharing while maintaining operational security. Streamlined clearance procedures enabled qualified veterans to contribute to sensitive programs. Most importantly, cultural changes had created environments where questions about background and expertise were encouraged rather than discouraged. Joe's final contribution to the program was a comprehensive manual titled Institutional Knowledge Preservation, a practitioner's guide to recognizing, preserving, and utilizing organizational expertise. The document combined technical procedures with practical wisdom about mentorship, knowledge transfer, and cultural change. It had become required reading for military leaders and was being adapted for use in civilian organizations. On this particular afternoon, Joe was visiting Herbert Field to participate in the dedication of the Peterson Center for Technical Excellence, a new facility that would serve as the program's research and development headquarters. As he walked through the hangar where his transformation had begun, he was accompanied by dozens of veterans whose lives had been changed by the recognition of their expertise. The ceremony was attended by senior military officials, veteran advocates, and the media representatives who had followed the program's development over the years. But the most important attendees were the young technicians who represented the future of military maintenance and operations, men and women who would carry forward both technical skills and the institutional wisdom that had been preserved through the program. As Joe approached the podium for his final public address, he looked out at an audience that embodied the transformation that was possible when organizations valued all forms of expertise. Veterans stood alongside active duty personnel, civilian contractors worked with military technicians, and experienced professionals shared knowledge with eager students. 5 years ago, I was just a janitor with a mop and a bucket, Joe began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had characterized his approach to every challenge throughout his career. But I was also a repository of institutional knowledge that had been developed over decades of military service. The difference between those two identities wasn't in what I knew. It was in whether anyone was willing to recognize and value that knowledge. He paused, looking directly at the young faces in the audience who would inherit the responsibility for maintaining and improving the systems that protected American interests around the world. The lesson we've learned isn't just about aircraft, maintenance, or electronic warfare systems. It's about understanding that expertise exists throughout our communities, often in the most unexpected places. Our responsibility is to create cultures that recognize, preserve, and utilize that expertise for the benefit of everyone. The standing ovation that followed was lengthy and heartfelt, but Joe was already thinking about the future. The program had achieved remarkable success, but the work of preserving and transmitting institutional knowledge would never be complete. Each generation of military personnel would face new challenges that required both current training and historical wisdom. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Joe remained in the hangar for a few quiet moments, remembering the morning 5 years earlier when he had been just another invisible contractor emptying trash cans. The transformation that had resulted from 30 minutes of diagnostic work had exceeded anything he could have imagined, but it had also validated something he had always believed, that knowledge, expertise, and the willingness to share them were among the most valuable gifts one person could offer to another. The invisible man had become visible, but more importantly, he had helped create systems that would ensure other invisible experts would never remain invisible again. The work would continue, carried forward by the hundreds of veterans and active duty personnel who had learned that expertise existed everywhere, and that recognizing and utilizing that expertise was essential to the success of any organization committed to excellence. The AC-130 Spectre that had started it all continued to fly missions around the world, its systems functioning perfectly thanks to maintenance procedures that combined current technology with institutional wisdom. But its greatest contribution wasn't to any single mission, it was to the understanding that valuable knowledge often existed in the most unexpected places, waiting to be recognized by leaders wise enough to look beyond credentials and job titles to the expertise that lay beneath. Joe Peterson's legacy wasn't just in the aircraft he had repaired or the program he had inspired. It was in the changed understanding that expertise and knowledge were resources to be treasured wherever they were found, and that the greatest achievements often came from recognizing the value that existed in the quiet professionals who worked in the background, carrying decades of wisdom and waiting for someone to ask for their help. The story had come full circle, but the mission continued, ensuring that institutional knowledge would be preserved, transmitted, and utilized for the benefit of those who served and those they protected. It was a mission that honored both the past and the future, recognizing that the best solutions often came from combining current capabilities with the hard-earned wisdom of experience. In the end, Joe's greatest achievement wasn't fixing an impossible problem. It was proving that impossible problems often had simple solutions when approached with the right knowledge, the right attitude, and the recognition that expertise existed everywhere, waiting to be discovered by those wise enough to look beyond the surface to the capabilities that lay beneath. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.